Welcome to Many Skills. I'm Aaron, and today I'm going to be going through with you my yellow recipe. I'll be going through two methods, one with using an airbrush and one without. Let's begin. Here I have two Assault Marines from the Indomitus box set that I'm painting up to be part of my Imperial Fist army. I start by merely priming the models black with Vallejo Airbrush primer. This can be done with a rattle can too. I just don't have one lying around, and it tends to be raining in Scotland, so getting outside to spray minis can be a bit of a waiting game. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Pink! To paint yellow! Bear with me, this works great for creating warm shadows, as you will see in future steps. I paint the full mini with Games Workshop's Emperor's Children. After using a lot of this paint on unfinished yellow miniatures, I have gone through a considerable amount, and the last bit of the pot was quite watered down with airbrush thinner. So this first layer didn't go down too well. I mixed up a rough match so I could continue. The shade is slightly different, but the end results are close enough. I use a cheap makeup brush to apply this to the miniature quickly. Next, I do a Zenithal highlight with GW's Wraithbone. I don't think about where the light is coming from too much. Instead, I aim to get some exciting contrasts whilst the highlights all roughly come from the same place. Again, with the airbrush, I keep the same PSI and mix the airbrush paint with some thinner to a nice milky consistency. I go slowly, building up thin, transparent layers of paint. For completing this stage with a brush, I am using a small Artist Opus Series D Drybrush. I recently got this brush and I am finding it great for slowly building up dry brushing highlights. Later, I use a makeup brush against this to see if I can get a similar consistency, and I think this brush is quite a bit easier to work with. Go slow until you get a pure Wraithbone highlight at your highest points. As you can see, dry brushing definitely builds a texture, but it is far easier than wet blending this stage. Finally, some yellow. And yes, I'm using GW's Iodine Yellow Contrast Paint. This works great for getting a good base yellow down and building some strong recessed shading. And in the pink shadows, this paint turns a lovely orange. I try to work one section of the model at a time, weaking away any pulling with my brush and pushing the paint into the recesses as much as possible. You do not need to be perfect here, as the highlighting stages should fix any uneven sections. Now I get back out the Series D again and start dry brushing. I am using a mix of yellow paints to try and get as good a match to my already painted Marines as possible. I would recommend just finding a yellow you like as a primary colour and using that, not this silly mix. Now, I start by doing a heavier dry brush with this, still focusing on the areas I want to be highlighted. As my main colour builds up, I add a lighter colour into the mix and start to focus on a smaller area. I do not wash the brush, as this allows the paint to mix within the bristles to create a smoother highlight. I keep adding more of my lighter colour, and whilst doing this, I am being more delicate with my brushing. I then add some off-white to the mix to get the extreme highlights. Do not worry at this stage if the model becomes less saturated, push the highlights more than what you think, as we are going to bring the yellow back in the next step. I try using a makeup brush for this stage, and I do not think the results are as good, but I bet with a little bit more patience and time, you could get just as good as a result. Now, to bring back some saturation. This is quite a simple step. I use a 1-1 mix of iodine yellow and contrast medium. This is watered down enough to give a good glaze while still being easy to control. I went over the whole mini in a thin coat and didn't have to worry too much about weaking up any pooling. If you want a stronger yellow, you can repeat this process. Now, depending on how much time you want to spend, you could stop here, but adding a few more highlights really helps make this scheme pop. Again, I do a light dry brush highlight with my pastel yellow and mix in an off-white to progress to a sharper highlight. Here, I aim my brush mainly at the edges and at the highest points of the mini. I am trying to make my edge highlighting stage as easy and as little as possible. For some reason, I wanted to add a highlight to my pauldrons. I don't think this ended up looking great, and I tried to fix it with darker paint and more contrast later. Also, I skipped this on the other model. I think my highlight colour was slightly too light here, and I went back over these with a darker colour later. Remember, it's just paint, and you can always go over it, or in worst case scenario, strip the model and try again. You don't need to edge highlight, but it is an excellent technique to practice when you can. Remember, it is called this for two reasons. You paint the edges of the model, but you also try and use the edge of your brush. This makes it much easier. The aim of this scheme is to bring down my painting time as much as possible. This yellow stage took a fraction of the time of my old technique, and I am thrilled with how they turned out. This was my first video, and I'd not only like to make more, but I'd like to make them as best as I can for you. If you have any feedback or comments, please leave them below or head over to my Instagram and ask me there. Thanks for watching, and remember, them minis ain't gonna paint themselves.